Hello. Well, Canva's bought Affinity. Let me tell you why that sucks. So, for those who aren't initiated, which I assume you wouldn't be on this video if you weren't, Canva's like a easy to use set of design tools and collaboration tools, mostly used by either amateur designers or marketing teams to create relatively simplistic graphics. It's become a lot more powerful over the years, but it's still kind of like a beginner-friendly tool. And that's not a problem necessarily if it fulfills a need, you know. Affinity, on the other hand, is the sort of leading Adobe alternative suite. It's been around for about 10 years. My personal history with Affinity is I started using it very, very early on in the early betas of Affinity Designer. So that would have been 2014, so 10 years ago, 2015. And it slowly kind of ate my world, and I ended up using Designer exclusively almost for the last 10 years without even really trying. Anyway, one company has bought the other. And let's have a quick look at the press release here from Canva. So since launching in 2013, we were on a mission to empower the whole world to design. Blah 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 blah. Today, we're incredibly excited to welcome Affinity to Canva as we set our sights on empowering every kind of designer. Trusted by more than 3 million creative professionals across the globe, Affinity's award-winning suite of professional design software has become a sought-after solution for everything from photo editing to complex graphic and vector design. Together, we're setting our sights on empowering every kind of team and organised to achieve their goals. So the main thrust of this is the stated intent from Canva is to introduce some more professional level design tools into their ecosystem, which makes an awful lot of sense. Also, Canva's become quite ubiquitous in recent years, so with marketing teams and things like that producing graphics of their own within Canva, and designers, I think, more or graphic designers at least, having to spend more time working around Canva, which I'm sure is very annoying. They've stated they're going to bring a lot of those collaborative features over and bring more professional tools to entice more users over to Canva, which is kind of like a let's pull you dragging and kicking into the ecosystem. So Affinity, they've also done they've done, I think, a press release somewhere, but they've that's it. I'm not watching the video, but basically this is a moment of great excitement, anticipation, and profound gratitude for all of you who have been part of our story so far. We know that those of you who put your faith in Affinity, some since launched our very first MadCap, or questions about what this means to the future of our products. Since the inception of Affinity, our mission has been to empower creators with tools that unleash their full potential, fostering a community where innovation and artistry flourish. We work tirelessly to challenge the status quo and delivering professional-grade creative software that is both accessible and affordable. So the thing that Affinity was, their big push back in the day was it was not super long after Creative Cloud became a thing. And I think a lot of people didn't want to pay subscriptions for Adobe's stuff. So they came out with some very low price. I think they're about £40 each to start with. They released Affinity Designer first, then Photo, then Publisher later down the line. And they're very, very competent bits of software. You can see in my doc, I've got Affinity Designer sat there, and it's been there for, I didn't even realise, 10 years now. So a lot of people were sort of like people pissed off with Adobe and their business practices, coming over and spending ultimately not a great deal of money on Affinity. And they've done this very much like, oh, none of this changes. Where I think it says, none of this changes at Canva. We found a kindred spirit. You can take Affinity to new levels. The extra resources will mean we get to deliver much more. But it's very standard boilerplate PR speak stuff. And I think given a lot of people came over to Affinity because they hate the idea of subscriptions, they hate the idea of Adobe, ideologically driven stuff. Also meant that Affinity has a sort of more mixed user group between sort of jobbing professionals and more hobbyists, that kind of thing. A lot of hobbyist users inside Affinity, which is going to get contentious from my perspective, where that is what I've always cared about less. Back when this came out, I was primarily a graphic designer. In subsequent years, I moved more into UX, product design, stuff like that. I was actually sort of in that transition when it came out, to be honest. And I've never had that much of an issue with, I have no ideological problem with paying Adobe for licenses, and also it's not very popular, but in the grand scheme of things, £50 a month, which is what it costs over here for Creative Suite, it's actually not a terrible deal. I've crunched the numbers. What I used to buy, Master Collection every however many years. Well, or the company I'd work for, I'd say, would buy me that every few years. It used to cost about £3,500, and ultimately, in the same amount of time, although there's not much incentive to move faster, Adobe costs less than it used to still. Although you're tied into pay forever and you can't stop at certain versions, which sucks. But if you work in this software every single day, it's not actually that much money to spend. And I think a lot of people disagree. That's never been a problem for me. That's never been my reason for moving over to Affinity. I just thought the software was good. In fact, I never moved over to Affinity Photo because I kind of think Affinity Photo kind of sucks. Whereas Affinity Designer does 99% of, not even that, actually technically it does less of what Illustrator does than Photoshop does to Affinity Photo, if that makes sense. But the core of it, given how different a vector application is versus a photo editing application is, Affinity Designer gets much closer to the mark. All the things that are in there work very well, and the things that are extra that you don't necessarily use in Illustrator kind of just aren't there, and that's fine. And I've always had Illustrator as well, so if I need to do it, I jump into Illustrator, and that's got less frequent over the years. So I'm not an ideologically driven person who's like, oh, I hate this because Adobe, they should try dealing with Autodesk, they're way worse. So my problem is the idea that it was sold to Canva, and also I think where they've fostered this spirit of, let's never have subscriptions, whatever, which is a big selling point, much bigger than I originally assumed it was going to be in the early days, that they're going to burn a lot of people. And also nothing amazing can come from this acquisition. And this doesn't come from a position of like a random speculation. It won't. My background is I've worked with a lot of these sort of companies. I used to work at a very similar kind of creative software company, and I've know several people sort of in a lot of the same places as Affinity and stuff. I know people at Adobe, right? I know people at Autodesk, this sort of thing, or have known. So there is a kind of an idea of what some of these motivations might be, I guess. It's probably not like an expert, but there's a few insights I might have. So what most likely will happen is Canva's probably being very straightforward in their motivations for doing this. They want to entice more professional designers over to their platform. This is a good move for them. It's a good idea from them for the most part. It means that they have a piece of software they can get a big head start on, writing some very competent, because Affinity stuff is very competently written, and have a very high-end design tool available from day dot with, and start working towards all of the integrations they want with Canva or the rest of the sort of Canva suite of tools. From their perspective, there's nothing wrong with this deal. They've spent, I think, reporting has said they've spent maybe $1 billion on this acquisition, which is pretty good. But from the opposite end of the spectrum, from Serif, so Serif are an old company, they're not new, they've been around forever. They made some, back in the day, what I thought were quite mediocre, also ran sort of applications until they brought Affinity out, which is custom, laser focused on being an alternative to Adobe Illustrator, Affinity Designer that came out. And for their perspective, there's no good that comes from this, in my opinion, where their focus will, in the shorter term, have to shift into integration, right? So they'll have their own roadmap, their own backlog of things they want to get done. But for the most part, this is all relatively mature software. They're pretty mature out of the gate. That's why they did so well, because they worked pretty damn well from version 1.0, which is a big part of why they've achieved such a relatively large foothold in the industry over the last 10 years. But their focus will inevitably shift from, in the short term at least, from a lot of those improvements into the integration work that need to happen to make it work better with Canva. That's just a thing that's going to happen. That will be prioritized. That's the big draw of this. In terms of revenue-wise, Affinity, in my opinion, again, this is quite unpopular. I've always thought Affinity was too cheap. They're charging, they have a very old school perpetual license model, and not in defense necessarily of subscriptions. I don't like subscriptions. I don't mind necessary subscriptions, because from the perspective of a software developer, revenue is a thing, right? You buy a piece of software, you sell a piece of software, you put the time up front to develop the features, you then market it. Your existing users need to say, hey, we want those features. Then you sell it, you get a bunch of revenue in, and with that money, that's all the money you're going to receive until the next time you create a version. And it's subscriptions for certain products makes an awful lot of sense. You know, I'm not saying that subscriptions to cereal is a good business model. I hate that kind of stuff. But to software, I don't mind as much, because what it does, it takes those spikes out of how you make money. It evens it out, right? So you're constantly getting paid, which means you can be a bit more dynamic about the things you do, because, you know, yeah, if you do make a V2 and you want to charge money for a V2, you have to make sure you get the blend of features right to a state that your users expect. And as those users get more mature, their expectations change. They become less positive, more negative, more nitpicky, because they get more committed to your platform. They find more problems, and they get incrementally harder to please unless you bring fresh people into the platform. Price being a barrier to entry, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, which means that, you know, if you have a release where your users aren't happy with it, there's a big dip in revenue, and there's a lot of complexity behind the scenes to make sure you've got enough money to weather those sort of storms. It's annoying. And software products in the past, people forget that some things never used to make V2 because they didn't do a compelling enough job, and it's like they've been getting thrown to the walls of the customers. I guess I'm probably a bit more sympathetic to that than most people are, but it's hard. So in that regard, subscriptions aren't a bad thing necessarily if they're products that you're selling that people use for work that they can rely on, and you're being honest and fair with it. I don't think it's a bad thing. People don't like it because they don't like the recurring cost, but it's not always bad, is what I'm saying. And certain companies, I think, nail it. The way Sketch have always run their licensing, which a lot of other companies have adopted now, which is you pay, it's sort of like a pseudo maintenance model, which is a thing that's common in the VFX industry, where you pay up until the most recent version, a certain cost each year. If you stop paying, you stop at that version, right? Instead of losing access. I always thought that was the best middle ground, because you paid for, and you can continue to invest in the progress of this application, and then it stops when you stop. JetBrains do a similar thing. I think it's the best way to sell software, to be honest, nowadays. I also think that at some point, I think Sketch has moved away from it, or they've got subscriptions plus this. Anyway, this is not a route that Affinity ever went, and I think that's kind of a problem, because charging £150 per year for their entire suite, or not per year, one-off for their entire suite, with an indeterminate V2 in the future, which I think took about 6 or 7 years in the end, means that investment, they've got all of these, so they've said they've got 3 million customers of 3 million seats, right? You can do the maths on this. That's 3 million times 150, which sounds like a lot. Over 7 years for 100 people, it is still quite a lot, but that's also affected their trajectory, right? Their speed of development, because I think, honestly, Affinity, the last 10 years have been moving a little bit too slowly. To get to V2 as late as they did, the thing is, they've not had, I think, enough financial resource to necessarily, and this is me speculating here, that I have no insight here, and also software development doesn't work in like a throw more money at it, things happen faster kind of way. It's not that simple. However, if they had more revenue, they'd have more financial resources to push harder at this. They've made money, they've made plenty of money, but in the grand scheme of things, so how popular product is compared to how much it costs and the size of team to support the size of user base they've had, it's very small, right? Or pretty small. So, yeah. It's they've not moved as quickly as I would like, and there's a lot of reasons for why that could be, but having more money would certainly help. I'm not saying they should have charged more because they would have made more versions. In the broadest possible sense, that is true, but in reality, not really. So, but either way, Affinity has always been a little bit too cheap, and they're still in the same very old school world of selling software and then courting new users to invest in a V2. I personally don't use Affinity V2 because I don't find it compelling enough. I tried a trial. I didn't think it moved the needle far enough in any one direction. Also, given that nowadays I don't actually use it as my primary everyday tool, it's just something I do vector bits and bobs in occasionally. It wasn't compelling enough for me, so I opted out. No ideological reason behind it, no ethical or whatever reason behind it. I just didn't, which is a problem, right? And there's always a funnel that goes downwards, and basically their financial model needs to change. They haven't charged enough. And if, Affinity could have gotten away with being, I think maybe a dual tier license thing where maybe they have a hobbyist or non-commercial license, which costs that £50, right? It's a very low barrier to entry, and it's maybe a bit expensive for a hobbyist, but a worthwhile investment. I think you're serious about doing any of this sort of stuff. Spending 50 quid on Affinity Photo to get something that does most of what Photoshop does, it's a pretty good deal. It's a pretty good deal. And maybe another tier for professional users, which is a bit higher, which allows for commercial work. Maybe, it's not popular. None of this is popular, but I'm talking about how you run a business here, right? Or how you make money doing software. If that was maybe £300, £200, that's still not a lot to spend one-off, or, on this previous sort of older model. But where they've introduced so many sort of hobbyist users into the marketplace with this pricing, they're much more sensitive, because they don't need Affinity. They like having it. It's not a necessity for them, right? They don't have any. They might think they do, but they don't have any professional sort of horses. Not professional, like horses in the race where like they rely on it, right? And their needs are different, and they're much more sensitive to price, to cost. So that now represents a big chunk of their market. And also by saying we don't do subscriptions and we never will, doesn't necessarily help when inevitably you do end up changing your pricing structure, and they will. So if we look in this thing here, it says there's an FAQ. Let's go to the FAQ down here. Blah, 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 spiel. None of that changes today. We go to the thing that matters. FAQ, what's happening? Got bought. Why have they decided to sell? We like them, basically. What will happen? Nothing, because that would be career suicide. The updates, yes, that always happens. The roadmap will not change anytime soon. I saw a thread on their forum saying like, oh, V2 will be paid, V2.5 will be paid on a subscription or whatever. No, these things don't move that quickly. They take probably a year, a couple of years to really start bearing fruit. But Canva's business model subscription, are there any plans to change how Affinity is sold? There are no changes to our current pricing model planned at this time. That sentence is having twins. With all our apps still available as a one-off purchase. What this basically says is, no, the prices will change, and they have to. I mean, I don't think that they are the right prices right now for the reasons I just stated, which I know sounds unpopular, but they haven't been charging enough for it, I don't think, and that they will most likely become a subscription service, which is not, again, like I've said a minute ago, I don't think is necessarily even that much of a problem. It's more, it will burn bridges an awful lot of their users who have these ethical, ideological reasons for, oh, I hate Adobe, for going over to them. And also a lot of these hobbyist users will get burnt. They won't stick around for that. They'll find something else. There are more alternatives out there which are priced differently, but with lower aspirations, I guess. But those tools are probably good enough. In fact, Canva's probably one of them. I assume Canva's got a free tier. I don't know. So I don't see much really positive coming of any of this, really. And given that development shift, we've established that I think they've moved the products forward a little bit slowly. Not quite as quickly as I personally would have liked for whatever reason. I can get a bit more technical on it, but there's given the fact it's a new application, with all software code bases, they tend to move quite quickly at first and then slow down over time. It has been 10 years, but even when you first build stuff, and especially if you're veterans who know what you're doing, which is very much the position Affinity came from, where they developed the entire suite, or Serif came from, where they developed the entire suite of Affinity software. It wasn't their first thing. They're already very well experienced in developing graphics software. So they would have made some good decisions on the basis of that. Also, technological decisions to make sure that they could move things quickly forward. And where I'm a sort of like an early person who's a hoverer on the forums and stuff like that, a lot of conversations are happening at this point 10 years ago. God, I've become old. Some of those haven't come to fruition. The rate at which certain features come out, like they haven't got plugins API. I think you've been talking about it since, 2016. I think 17. It still doesn't exist. Stuff like this. Certain parts of the application move too slowly. And for whatever reason, maybe they've been a bit ambitious with their code base, maybe, you know, bugs, maybe resources, you know, unforeseen circumstances, lots of reasons for it, but the product's moved a little bit slow, right? I think in Serif management, they've, you know, the revenue's not what you make today, it's what you make in the future. But getting paid today doesn't matter. It's the next paycheck that counts, right? So this is a good move from them financially, but, you know, focus will have to shift. They will get more resources. In the short term, they will make more money as a company, but they will have to spend a significant amount of time making sure, you know, this deal is only short. It only happened very quickly. I think I read somewhere this thing happens in like 2 months. Yes, here you go. We had to say selling Serif was not on our mind at all. When Canva contacted us only a couple of months ago, there was something about it which just felt right. It's probably £1 billion that felt right, to be honest, Ash. Or, you know, whatever. The intent of the company, the intent of what people say to you versus what they do when they're faced with money is very different. It's not even a personal attack, it just is. You know, it's not, I don't actually have an ethical problem with any of this happening. I'm just saying what most likely will be the result of it, I guess. So they're going to have to dedicate a lot of resources into making sure their tools work really well. Canva, great for Canva use in the short term. They're going to have some attrition on their user base, which is probably only going to increase. I don't see long term this is a move to make Canva this Adobe competitor, because, you know, in 10 years Affinity has done very well, but I don't think they've materially affected Adobe's bottom line. You know, Adobe was already a big company when they announced Creative Cloud. They've become a stratospherically huger company in that time. It makes that much money. You know, Adobe have been around for a long time. This hasn't hurt them as much as you'd expect, put it that way, because they make that much money. So, yeah, I don't see this really panning out in the long term. Making Canva, it'll make it a better product. All power to Canva in this. I haven't actually got a problem with Canva in this. It all makes sense for them. It'll make a better solution for them. But it kind of makes Affinity not a dead end as such, but it makes it a less enticing proposition for current users, because let's say if Affinity was $20 a month, right? The full Creative Suite, including things like Premiere and After Effects and all this sort of stuff, is like 50. You've got some predatory stuff you want to cancel, whatever, but it's 50 quid a month versus 20 quid a month. I would pay 50 for Adobe over 20 quid for Serif, I'm afraid. I only use one of their products. And, you know, if I was using these day in, day out, I mean, I wouldn't pay for either right now, because the majority of my time is spent in things like Figma, right? and DaVinci Resolve and Fusion and, like, you know, other software. But if I was in a situation where I was using this every day, given the choice, I'd pay more for Adobe at this point. I think a lot of their users will feel the same. Anyway, that's it from me. And yeah.